Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio here. I feel like we need to make this a monthly thing, maybe even more than that. The monthly Mike. Mike Miller joining us, longtime beat writer for Indiana football and basketball with the Bloomington Herald-Times, now retired and living in luxury in the central Midwest. Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I love that idea. I love the monthly Mike updates here on CrimsonCast. Maybe we need to give that a go.
I think it's what the people want, Mike. It really is. So we have to give the people what they demand. And first and foremost, before we get started with talking about IU football here, I don't know if you saw the thing I tweeted earlier. It was a retweet of a series of graphs that this gentleman on Twitter had done about college football teams and programs and how they had performed since 1946, and basically looked at winning percentage and had all this whole tally of everything. And I looked at it immediately, and I felt duty-bound, as a chronicler of things, to tweet it out, but I also advised that nobody actually look at it, because when you look at it, you realize that IU football has the worst winning percentage of any team not named Vanderbilt in the Power 5 conferences since that day. Now, it's a little unfair because IU's best ever season was the year before these charts started. But, man, that was after such a great week, I felt like that was a little bit of a cold water, like, slap in the face, like, hey, don't forget who you are.
I did take a peek at that. I saw that, and I briefly opened that, and I scanned for Indiana, and sure enough, I found them. And it's something, because it's something obviously everybody knows, but when you see the cold hard numbers, or you just see it laid in front of you, it's just the ineptitude over decades and generations is just really quite striking, even when you know the history.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when you look at IU, and I think this is what makes this week so poignant for IU football, is that when you know the history, when you know how much this program has struggled, and it's not just like an old-time struggle. It's like you look at Northwestern, you look at Kansas State, you look at those sorts of programs who have always kind of been in the same general exterior orbit of the college football solar system like Indiana is. And, it's like they sucked in the 70s or they sucked in the 80s. And for Indiana, it's like, man, it's just a really consistent thing. There's these huge holes in the resume. And frankly, like a recent one was at the end of the last decade and the beginning of the 2010s. Like it's so hard for Indiana to escape the gravitational pull of its own lesser nature. And it's really what makes this particular juncture of this college football season for IU so intriguing.
It was, and even just to go back to last week, I was texting with some friends as I was watching the game develop on Saturday, and it was just another one of those moments of Indiana just cannot have nice things when you lose Michael Penix and you have that hot start and you're just kind of feeling your way through the game, and all of a sudden you lose your quarterback, and it's sort of like, what? Why does this happen? How does this happen? It's rather remarkable, but yeah, it's sort of set up in a way that. You go back to that last week's game, and they were able to show you some things. I think that they don't consistently show you. Winning a game like that, and now from here on out, you're going to have a slew of games that I'm sure we'll get into that are going to be much the same nature. Where you have the Nebraskas, the Northwesterns, maybe you count that Purdue game in there too. But just the fact that they could go in there and get a win like that against the Maryland team that. Has some skill, has some playmakers, and really just do the kinds of things this program doesn't consistently do. I think, again, like you said, just makes it really, really intriguing these next couple weeks, especially.
Let's talk in more depth about that Maryland game. This is a program that you're pretty familiar with, Maryland, as well as Indiana, both of the programs, and it seemed like when Maryland came into the league, people. They looked at Rutgers. They're like, okay, Rutgers is probably a relatively easy mark. People weren't quite sure what to make of Maryland. Maryland had a little bit of success under Ralph Friedgen, and then they've really been up and down. They obviously had a terrible set of circumstances that they got themselves into last year. They bring in Mike Locksley as their head coach, and it seems like Maryland has a lot of really athletic players. They have a lot of really exciting playmakers, and yet they seem to be struggling like to punch through ahead of where Indiana is, even in the hierarchy of the Big Ten East. And I don't know that a lot of people thought that that's how things were going to go. So I guess like from a macro level, what's your perspective on all of that?
It's interesting, and I'm going to borrow an idea from someone else, which is, it's so true. It's stuck with me that this Maryland team, for some of its flaws and some of its its injury issues that they've experienced this year, it just feels like the same Maryland team we've seen year after year in the Big Ten that has some playmakers, has some really exciting weapons, but just doesn't really have that cohesion or just that feel of completion to the roster. Really, just a feeling of a real design or plan with the roster. I think some of the recruiting leveled out a little bit with Randy Edsall, but it's interesting because they always seem to have one or two guys that make you go, you got to take these guys serious. And I think that's kind of what you've seen with them this year. I mean, it was a very boom or bust team that coming into last week was it's the kind of offense that would rattle off a 60-yard touchdown run, then go 3 and out, followed by a 55-yard touchdown run. That kind of offense. But yeah, it's a kind of program that I think that the play for Mike Locksley making him the head coach was certainly to tap into those recruiting connections he has in the Washington, Maryland, Virginia area. It's just a matter of will they have some sort of real defined plan for that roster. So it was an interesting matchup from that because you were going into face a wounded Maryland team, but one that had some playmakers and some potential there to hurt you, especially with some of the things we've seen from the IU defense at times this year. But it was certainly an interesting matchup, and as you said, I mean it's the kind of program that you just sort of saw, certainly on Indiana's tier, and a program that I think that for years to come will still be one that Indiana has to both compete with, I think, to some degree for prospects, the same kind of caliber of prospects, if not, the same, the actual players. But it's an interesting program just from the construction of it.
So looking at the game that Indiana played there last week, here you have an Indiana team that had done everything that you expected them to do throughout the course of the year up to that point and really hadn't exceeded any of those expectations. And this was a weird game because it was a road favored game for Indiana in conference, which we looked through the records, that hadn't happened that terribly often. IU had fared pretty well in those sorts of games in the past 5 or 6 years, but the idea that they were going to go in and be favored against Maryland, I think it was something that gave some people pause. And you mentioned it, the quarterback injury that happens in the second quarter, and you end up with Peyton Ramsey and it feels like the ghosts of past losses and past disappointments kind of comes over a lot of the Indiana fan base. And yet Indiana, the team, really performed in a way that's felt different from the way that they've performed the last couple of years. And certainly you've been had a front row seat to a lot of those sorts of experiences with this team. I mean, do you detect a bit of a difference in the way that IU handled its business in this contest than what they did, say, in the first 2 years of the Allen tenure?
It's tough to say because still there were so many components of this game where, whether it was penalties or, I feel like, clock management in the second half. I mean, things that really made you scratch your chin and go, man, this is not the recipe for a road win in the Big Ten. You still had some of those components there in this game, but and even with losing the quarterback, you lost a significant part of your offense with, not really being able to get a guy like Walt Phillier going with some of the bubble screens they've had success with, with Michael Penix being able to just dish him out. So it was almost kind of a weird performance in that degree where there were still some points or some components of this game where you're just like, man, how do they overcome this? How did they overcome this? And yet, still, I think you have to give a lot of credit to Peyton Ramsey for his performance. I thought, the touchdown pass to Nick Westbrook was maybe one of the best balls he's thrown in his IU career. I think it kind of sent me back to I think it was the FIU game last year. Might have been a touchdown throw to Donovan Hale. It was just a beautifully thrown ball, which, you see him make passes every once in a while. You're like, where is that all the time?
Right.
You saw a little bit of that. You saw some receivers make plays. I mean, Donovan Hale makes plays. Nick Westbrook, appears really for, frankly, for me, it felt like the first time all season I'd seen Nick Westbrook.
And Peyton Hendershot makes a return appearance after what it seemed like several weeks of not being involved, and yet Whop Philyor didn't really have much of a game. It was interesting because we talked about this a little bit on the post game recap. IU has a lot of weapons this year, and it feels like, Mike, they've had a lot of weapons even going back into the Kevin Wilson era consistently, and yet they've struggled to use all of them. And it really does feel like Kalen DeBoer, the offensive coordinator, has done a really good job of using all those weapons and especially using certain weapons when other weapons are being shut down by opposing defenses or when a guy's just having a bad game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really one thing with the offense that has really stuck out to me this year is, I think there are maybe some subtle differences, just looking at the offense on the field and the way it operates. And certainly, the ability to when something's not working, make that adjustment in game is certainly there. But yeah, you're seeing things like that. You're seeing, touchdowns to start games, touchdowns to start the second half, things that just weren't there last year and certainly over the course of time. It's a lot of little things like that, I think, that have really added up. And also with that, you'd be remiss not to really give some credit to the offensive line. I think that, that's a unit I think I was on CrimsonCast back in August, laying the hammer down on the offensive line. Just wasn't really sure that this unit was really going to be up to snuff this year in the Big Ten. I just had some questions, and losing their most experienced player, probably their cornerstone, plugging in some guys, Matthew Bedford, a guy they were really excited about. I mean, they've done a really, really solid job. I think they're getting better as the season's gone on. Just looking at the rushing success they've had the last couple of weeks, it certainly bodes well for what they can do the second half of the schedule. But yeah, there's a lot of little things. There are certainly some other little things that I think you can nitpick and question.
Sure.
But there are some other little things that you can look at and say these are adding up to make just the slightest bit of difference for a team that was able to move the ball last year in the last few years, just wasn't able to really cash in and make the sort of plays they need to make.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody who's being realistic about this team would say, hey, everything's great, everything's fine, the ship's just sailing smoothly. There's obviously a lot of growing pains still, and I think that's both with the coaching staff and with the players. And yet, we took pains to point this out on the podcast on Sunday, winning cures a lot of ills. And I think for IU fans, for IU media, for people that have observed this program over a long time, you get used to focusing on the negatives, the things that they're not doing right, because more often than not, they've added up to losses. They've been close losses, they've been competitive losses, they've been losses in double overtime to Michigan, stuff like that. But rarely does it like, oh, well, they made all these mistakes and they still won the game. And that's I found myself kind of having a hard time getting my head wrapped around all of that on Sunday in a good way. It's like, oh, okay, well, we can still have things that we complained about, but the team won. And I think it's going to be interesting moving forward with this team. And look, it's hard to say how they're going to handle success. It's hard to say how other teams are going to handle viewing Indiana as a successful team, what that does to their preparation, their readiness to play IU. I think sometimes IU has benefited from people taking them very lightly in the past. But for in the short term, at least, I think you're right. I think there's improvements, certainly on the offensive line. You've seen improvements in the skill sets. I think the defensive alignment, like the players in general, like the guys we expected to show up on defense this year haven't to some degree, but that's been okay because other people have started to show up in their stead. And again, that's not something we're used to seeing with IU football.
Yeah, and I think to go back to one of your points, just handling some of those little moments, I think will be really interesting to watch, on the big picture level these next few weeks, because this is always the point in the year you get mid-late October, certainly November, where it's really when the death march sorts to start, where you get that gauntlet of games against maybe it's Ohio State, Michigan, back to back, something like that, where morale just seems to be crushed and You always emerge with that game against Purdue at the end of the schedule, and often that's a pretty big game. But and I look at the schedule this year, and I'm not sure I really see that death march potential there. These are, I see some winnable games. I think that Penn State game is definitely the only one I'm really looking at saying, nah, I don't think so. But you look at 3 of these next 4, and I mean you like where Indiana's positioned going into them, at least right now. We'll see what happens this week. But
right.
Usually right around this time of year, you're always saying, well, man, how are they going to emerge from these next 3 weeks of basically unwinnable games? Whereas now you're looking at it and it's just sort of like, these aren't really unwinnable games. I mean, they position themselves, they show themselves that they are capable of playing in these. I think they've showed us so far that they might be capable of performing in against these types of opponents. So I just think it's interesting the way that the way last week's game developed, and playing through some of those things, and eventually coming out better for it. I'm curious to see if that'll be anything that emerges on on the macro level heading into November.
Yeah, a lot of it depends really on the health of Michael Penix, because I think as well as Peyton Ramsey played in relief in that Maryland game, it's the difference between jumping into a car that's already driven for 50 miles and the engine's warm and everything's going, and jumping into a car cold and having to prime the pump and start the engine and try to get it going. We haven't yet really seen Peyton Ramsey have to do that in any game so far this year. And while, Michael Penix wasn't perfect in the first quarter and a half against Maryland, it certainly to me looked like, with the exception of that throw to Westbrook, his passes were a lot more on target and where they needed to be in the offense than what Ramsey was able to provide in that Maryland game. And you look at, traveling to Nebraska, playing against a pretty good Northwestern defense. I mean, both of those games, you're just like, man, the ceiling of this team feels very high, but it really does depend on having their regular starting offensive personnel in.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for this team, it's basic stuff. I mean, it's just a totally different team with Michael Penix. I mean, Peyton Ramsey comes in last week, and again, you got to give him credit, which I feel like we're always doing. We're always trying to give Peyton Ramsey some credit here.
I'm not, but anyway, go ahead.
I feel like I need to in some ways.
It almost, does. It feels like there's like a silent contract you enter into when you engage in any IU football talk. Now, Mike, before you start, you better give Peyton Ramsey some credit at some point here.
Yes, he's always prepared.
Yes,
and that's the thing. Like, that's a situation where you're glad to have a Peyton Ramsey. If you need a quarterback in a game, but once again, he comes in and the offense. I don't know if this was so much players, it was play calling, it was just, it just, things looked tentative, or, it looked unsure. The direction of the offense looked a little unsure. And certainly you're kind of moving at different speeds with these 2 different quarterbacks, but I mean, it's a noticeable drop off between one and the other. And I mean, it's just, you're dealing with a ceiling that is significantly, I think significantly lower.
Let's just talk about that, because there was a lot of positive talk at Peyton Ramsey, and I think that's ultimately deserved. But I also think that it's interesting to think about what is it? We've seen Peyton Ramsey now for 2.5 seasons, essentially, and you've obviously covered the team. You're getting a chance to watch him on television now. Can you dissect what, other than arm strength, which is an obvious difference between him and Penix? When you see these 2 guys in the pocket running essentially the same offense, what does your trained eye see as the primary difference or differences between the 2 of them?
I think off the top of my head, I just watching Michael Penix, I think that I might be totally off base here, but I think that he knows he's really good. I think he knows he can make these throws. I think it just comes natural that he can do these types of throws that makes him special. Whereas I wonder, to some degree, if there's a little more thinking going on in Peyton Ramsey's head in the course of making a play or making a throw, where he understands his limitations to some degree, and that kind of informs, for better or worse, the way he goes with a pass or a play or what have you. It's. And 2, the other thing is, just how much does play calling change when you go from Penix to Ramsey? How much are coaches kind of going through those same, mental, courses where they're wondering, what can we actually get away with calling here in this situation? I wonder if it's that to some degree.
It is an interesting thing. I know when I was watching him in the game on Saturday, it just seems to me like there's some plays where he gets set and he feels confident in what he's going to do and he executes it. The Westbrook touchdown was a great example of that. I mean, he knew exactly where he wanted to throw that ball. He didn't worry about what was going on around him, and he dropped it into a very tight space, and it looked like an excellent throw. But there's a lot of plays where it almost seems like he's constantly worried about getting sacked. He's constantly worried about something happening that's not supposed to happen. And I think I mentioned on the earlier podcast, it's like he's afraid of making a mistake. And it kind of ties in with what you were talking about. It's like if you're thinking too much in the pocket as a quarterback, if you're too cognizant of your own limitations, it can have a negative impact. Obviously, you want quarterbacks to play smart, but you almost don't want them to play with, like, you don't want to think about everything. Like that I'm reading this book right now called The Sports Gene, and there's this interesting idea in there called chunking theory, and it's this idea that experts in athletics, especially, they're able to process a lot of information at once and then discard the unnecessary information and zero in on the thing that's going to make them successful. And it feels like Michael Penix has that naturally, where he can just lock in on, okay, this is where this is going to be, and this is where I need to get it to, and I have the arm strength to get it there. And Peyton Ramsey might have some of that ability, but it feels like he's not quite as capable of zeroing in on the things that need to be focused on a given play. So it's interesting. And look, I think, as you mentioned, it's great to have him able to come in and run the offense. But it is interesting trying to think about anytime you have this sort of a comparison where you've had a quarterback for 2+ years and then you've got a new quarterback that's taking his place, but you're still getting the old quarterback coming in. I'm always fascinated by, like, what makes one guy more effective than another guy. And it's going to be worth looking at down the rest of the season, because the health of Michael Penix is an issue at this point, and I don't think he's made of glass. I've kind of resisted that description that we've seen from people over the course of the last week or so, but it is obvious he's gotten injured on more than one occasion, and it's like, as good as the offense has looked with him in there, you really don't want that to happen, but you can't necessarily count on it not happening at this point.
Yeah, and how does that sort of play into just sort of, whether they're designed runs or not? Because it feels like that's been a part of the offense. And at some point, if you're Kalen DeBoer, are you just trying to be ultra protective of this guy who, whether or not he's made of glass, there's I think everyone's probably a little just concerned, that you don't want, that big hit or that big, play. I don't know. Have they said exactly what he's dealing with this week?
No, I mean, there's been some speculation, but nothing that's been actually stated. And look, I think if you look at the circumstances surrounding his exit from the game and kind of read between the lines, you can figure out what's going on. It's going to be a game time sort of thing, and that creates problems for us as we try to figure out what's going to happen moving forward with this IU football team, when you're probably not going to know until after warm-ups happen who's going to be under quarterback. And that's, obviously we're the least important people here when it comes to trying to figure this stuff out and when it comes to who needs to know. But it is tough sitting around, and as we talk about this next game, IU traveling to Nebraska for the first time in conference play. They're a favorite. They're probably less of a favorite than they should be if you look at straight numbers from like S&P Plus. And yet almost all of that is predicated on Michael Penix being the quarterback. And it's like, well, we just don't know what's going to happen at this point.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, we will be flying blind until about 2:30 Eastern on Saturday, basically. I mean, I think you probably have a pretty good idea of what the team will look like without Michael Penix. It's just kind of the same team we've kind of gotten to know these last couple of years. But like you said, I mean, to echo you, I mean, it's a totally different team. The potential is so much higher, and I think it's got to be really frustrating as a fan to kind of go through this week and know that this is a game you can go on the road and steal, for lack of a better term. But those odds certainly fall if one guy's not available.
Let's talk about this Nebraska game a little bit. So if you look at the S&P Plus, which is a predictive rating system that's based upon the way that teams perform against other teams, and it takes all those ratings into account. So taking Maryland as an example, Maryland, after last week's game, they are 47th in S&P. They have an offense that's ranked 51st, a defense that's ranked 58th, and special teams is 127th, a really bad special teams unit for Maryland. Nebraska is one spot better. They're 46th so far. They're 44th in offense, so slightly better than Maryland. They're 61st on defense, so slightly worse. And they have a special teams that's ranked 126th, which is almost exactly as bad as Maryland. And you look at this Northwestern, that's 2 weeks from now. You look at this Nebraska team and what they've done this year, and it's a weird kind of mixed bag. You know, it's not too dissimilar to, frankly, to what we've seen out of Maryland. They started off the season, they scored points, they beat a couple of low FBS squads, they beat South Alabama, they beat Northern Illinois. Those two wins sandwiched a loss at Colorado, which isn't a bad loss by any means, but it was a game where they were leading in the first half, and then they ended up falling kind of to pieces later on in the game. And then they barely beat Illinois at Illinois. That was a turnover fest that Illinois was not ready to win. And then the wheels have fallen off. And in the last 3 games that Nebraska's played, they got blown out at home by Ohio State. I mean, so did Indiana. No shame there. Then they barely beat Northwestern 13-10, and then they got blown out at Minnesota 34-7, and then they had a bye week. This is not a Nebraska team that's playing good football right now, Mike.
No, it's not, and it's. I wonder how much of that is mental from that Ohio State game where I think they had game day there, and it's just this big spectacle. And certainly, this team came in with preseason hype, and which to be honest, I'm far from a Nebraska football expert, but it did seem a little premature that this season would be a year where they're, even with the Big Ten West the way it is, that they would, suddenly climb the ranks there. But like you said, these last 3 weeks, I mean, it's a hard team to really understand, I don't want to say much like Indiana, but it's a hard team to really understand maybe what you're going to get this week, especially because, Indiana's coming to town. It's always a situation for the opponent that they look at this game and they say, well, this is the one, we can get, this is one we need to get to really get where we want to go. I don't know. I am kind of curious, though, just how much of that is just a mental hangover, from just getting the doors blown off, late last month. But yeah, it's a weird team.
Yeah. I mean, their starting quarterback, Adrian Martinez, sophomore, has had an injury. I don't think there's final news yet as far as whether he's going to be able to play or not. And it's not like he was being terribly effective when he was in there. I mean, 7 touchdowns, 5 interceptions through 5 games. His replacement, Noah Vedral, came into the Minnesota game and was not particularly great. 14-23, 135 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. It's a team overall on the season that, when you look at what they've done offensively, they're averaging about 5.5 yards a play on offense. You compare that to IU. IU's averaging 6.3 yards a play. And certainly defensively, Nebraska's been a lot more permissive in the yards per play category than what we've seen out of Indiana, which is certainly a positive sign. It's still a Nebraska team that's a bit in flux. I mean, I think a lot of people, it's certainly people that were voting on these things, they looked at what happened towards the end of the season last year with Nebraska and as you mentioned, thought this was going to be a big coming out party for Scott Frost and company, and yet it really does seem like a roster and a team that's in a bit of disarray right now. And it's weird to think about this, but Indiana is just playing better football over the course of the month of October than Nebraska is, and now they go into Memorial Stadium, the big Memorial Stadium, with a shot here at potentially coming away with a victory. That we've been waiting for IU to play at Nebraska for the entire time Nebraska's been in the league, and this is the first time that it's happened. How does IU, how do you think they handle going into this kind of an environment where it's obviously a historic college football environment, but the team isn't really playing up to those standards right now?
Yeah, and this is a program that I think has handled environments pretty well over the years. Even just going back to the end of last year, I was really impressed with ha- 2.5 quarters of play at Michigan to kind of close down the year last year. I mean, it's a team that handles itself well in environments. I think I'm not too worried from that perspective. I'm curious though, just how much they were able to really take from the Maryland game, because I think that could be really instructive for the way this team really handles its business down the stretch here. I mean, again, that a win at Maryland just, I think, shows fans that this team can win the kind of game it doesn't always win, or the games it's not always expected to win. And I think to some degree, I think you want to hope that it shows players that too, that they can go on the road and they can beat a talented team, a team with talented players. I think that to a large degree that not totally unlike the Michigan State game, you're going on the road and facing a team with, honestly, I think a pretty similar caliber of player. I mean, I don't think Nebraska is recruiting worlds away differently than Indiana right now. And again, Indiana has a few more years in a system. They have at least a head coach. You're right. I mean, things are trending in different directions right now. I think I always keep going back to the mental part of things right around here, because it's always such a mental game for the Indiana Hoosiers at this point in the year, whether it's handling defeats, and this year you're handling some wins, and you're handling a record that this program is just not accustomed to having. So I just think it'll be really curious to see how they perform here, because again, I think we learned something from the Maryland game. We learned something from the Michigan State game, and I think it positions this team to have some success this week, and it's a really, really fascinating matchup. Without getting too deep into the nitty gritty, which I am not at all qualified to talk about right now.
Well, I mean, I will say this: it's from an offensive standpoint, like, Nebraska's got some problems. I mean, I mentioned the Adrian Martinez thing. Now, Adrian Martinez is not just their starting quarterback; he is their second leading rusher, despite having missed a game already this season with 341 yards. Their leading rusher is this guy, Dedrick Mills, who's rushed for 350 yards. He's got 7 touchdowns, but in his last 3 games, he's rushed for 67 yards, 26 yards, and 28 yards. So he's not getting a tremendous number of carries. Their third leading running back is a guy named Maurice Washington, who's a sophomore. Maurice Washington, it was announced earlier in the week by Scott Frost, is not going to be a part of the team this week. Mm-hmm. Which means that Nebraska's going into this game basically missing its top 3, 2 of its top 3 running threats, and then its 4th highest rush total is held by a freshman wide receiver. And its 5th highest rush total is held by the backup quarterback. It's a really bizarre sort of setup for this Nebraska team. They don't have a lot of guys that catch the ball either. Their leading receiver so far on the season has 27 receptions, and when you compare that to, say, a team like Indiana, who's just throwing the ball all over the field this year, Indiana's leading receiver is Whop Phillier. He's got 43 receptions. Peyton Hendershot's number 2 on the team. He's got 27. So there's just a whole different book of offensive proliferation, I guess, for IU versus Nebraska. But a lot of it, as you mentioned, comes back to this idea of, okay, you've got that. That's great. Can you do that on the road? Can you do it for a second week in a row? And can you do it in a place you've never played before against a team that, while they've certainly had some problems this month, isn't going to just roll over for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of going back to the statistical analysis, I mean, you look at the flip side of things. I was looking up earlier just where Nebraska is defensively against the run. They've given up some chunks. I'm going to be curious to see, just given the quarterback situation, what will that running game look like? I mean, is it going to be there? Is it going to be a situation where they can maybe take some of the pressure off or even get it going, to an adequate level? But there's a lot on both sides of the ball, I think, to this matchup that, if not outright plays to Indiana's favor, but it certainly gives them, an inch or an avenue to maneuver themselves for a pretty good week.
So to finish things off here, I'm going to ask you 2 different channels worth of final questions. The first question I'm going to ask you is, what is the rest of the season scenario if IU loses the game at Nebraska that's coming up this weekend? So they lose the game, they're 5-3, and they've still got obviously the 4 games remaining this season. So what do you see the ending scenario being for IU in those 4 games if they lose this weekend?
Well, this is where this is where it gets really interesting, because to this point, I mean, they've basically followed the course I think most people thought they would follow. You know, you win the first 3 against the non-con, you get Rutgers and Maryland. So you're basically on course right now. This is where it gets interesting, though, and it's hard to say. I mean, I think we've seen some things, we've learned some things about who they are and what they have. You know, the types of arrows they have in their quiver. But yeah, I think it's a weird sort of matchup next week against Northwestern. You know, Indiana football is just weird. I don't even need to keep saying that.
If you're listening to this podcast, you know it already.
Yeah, it's every week's going to be a little weird. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, because this is where it's fascinating to me, because we followed this team to this point. They've basically, you know, followed the they followed the expected course to get here to late October with their 5 wins, beating the teams they should beat, losing to the teams that they're probably going to lose to. And now here you go to a game where, yeah, I mean, a win here obviously sets you up on a course to play into December, but I don't know. I mean, because it's just so hard to predict with Indiana football. It's almost just an exercise in futility, because we've seen so many times where, you know, you can go on the road and have a good performance and come home and just be utterly flat. And they've certainly had some utterly flat performances in the last year and a half. So, you know, it's so hard to predict. But man, I will say that I think they're going to get that 6th win. I think my preseason 5-7 prediction is not looking so great, but whether that's this week, next week, or November 23rd against Michigan, I'm not sure. But you know, I will say this: IU fans should be grateful to me. This is the first time in like 5 years I have not gone on the record somewhere to predict that Indiana will beat Michigan in football. So
this is what we've been waiting for.
This should be what you guys have been waiting for. That was my big bold prediction the last 5 years, and not great.
We'll see. I mean, it's there were rumors today that Harbaugh's trying to find an out to get back to the NFL. It's like, part of me was like, hey, let's have that happen before November 23rd. And then part of me was like, no, let's wait. You know, it might actually be for the best. Well, let me ask you this then. Let's assume Indiana wins the game for hypothetical purposes. And now they're 6-2 and they've got Northwestern the following week. And then they've got a bye, I think, you know, shortly after that. Like how is, let me maybe kind of channel that question in with this. Like, how much do you think belief and confidence from winning can affect positively this particular IU team's fortunes?
It's a good question, because they've never really had it.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's like how would getting a unicorn for Christmas affect you personally? It's hard to really put your head around it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it goes back to, you know, at least let me preface by saying it goes back to what I said earlier. You're always, you know, awaiting the death march in October, November if you're Indiana. Excuse me. So yeah, I mean, you're really in uncharted territory when you start getting to the point where you have, you know, 6 wins before the month even turns to November. That's always, I think, the key thing with Indiana football. It always just seems that, you know, my God, you know, I go back to last year after that game against Minnesota. I mean, everyone was just they were spent. Everyone was just mentally just beaten down.
Penn State followed by that game. It was just kind of like, ugh.
Exactly. And it always seems to happen that way with Indiana, where there's just always some sort of events, whether it's the schedule, where it's the, you know, the way games have unfolded, whether it's injuries, what have you. There's always something to knock them back a peg or two. So, you know, that's always the $1 million question. What will Indiana do if it ever creates some sort of prosperity for itself? It's always looked prosperity in the face and said, nah, no thanks. So that's just what's so fascinating to me is when and if and when they're able to actually seize this prosperity, how do they handle it? I don't know, but that's always the one thing I've wanted to see, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been curious about that. But it's just so rarely happened, and it's always been the thing where, you know, mentality-wise, you know, it's just always been the opposite. It's always been, my God, we're just kind of playing out the schedule. You know, things just never go our way. It's just always just sort of, again, a death march to December. So yeah, it's that's extremely interesting just to kind of see how they could handle such a thing.
It's going to be a fascinating weekend and beyond. Just waiting to see exactly what happens with all of this. And we'll be back with Mike Miller later on certainly this season, but we can't do it again this month, apparently, because we're only allowed one Mike exposure per month on CrimsonCast. So we try to make the most of it. Mike, enjoy your luxurious retirement, and we will occasionally call on you to bestow some pearls of wisdom upon us here about IU football.
It is my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. Mike
Miller joining us here on CrimsonCast. Thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back probably Friday morning. We'll have Taylor Lehman. We'll have our new segment featuring James Turner hitting the gambling world, looking at college football. I'm Galen Clavier. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.